Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar today. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and from Enfield Voices, and this is one of the many webinars we do where we cover a number of issues. And today we're going to look at an issue that's been around all my life and well before that, and that's the issue of racism. And we know that on May the 25th, 2020, George Floyd in America was murdered by a white policeman. And that led to protests across the globe. And it led to the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we've got Delia Mattis with us today, who was instrumental in getting that going in the North London borough, the London borough of Enfield, and has a national profile as well. So we're going to talk to her about that. We're going to talk to her about her activism, but we're also going to talk about how important it is to talk about race so that we can confront, however radical we think we are, our own prejudices. Anyhow, Delia, thank you for joining us today. And can I first ask you a bit, if you could tell us a bit about yourselves and your activism and what motivated you in the first place?
Oh, thank you. And thank you for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be invited to come and speak to local Enfield issues, especially after doing so much on like a national platform, but I'll get into that. What motivated me? I think for most Black activists, we are activists from a very young age, actually, before we even realise we are activists. It starts with, I mean, I grew up in Sheffield, so it starts with dealing with the microaggressions that you face in schools that are mainly white, and knowing that you're being treated differently, but not being equipped to deal with it. You can't articulate what is happening to you, but you can feel the weight of it. And that carries on throughout your school life, or it did for me, throughout my school life, and so on. And some years ago, when I worked in the civil service, people kept asking me, because I was always outspoken. Don't think that's going to surprise anybody that knows me. People kept asking me to become a union rep, and so eventually I became a union rep, and then I found my political voice and started getting involved in more and more activism, and that led to party political activism when Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party, and now it's and then with the Black Lives Matter uprising, it was such an awakening last year, and I think that although, you know, there's been a so-called anti-racist movement in this country for a long time, Black Lives Matter gave every Black activist a different level of a voice. You know, it really gave us the opportunity to speak out about anti-Black racism and how that affects us in society, and how that affects us, you know, institutionally, and how that affects us in education, and how that affects the Black community and its relationship with the police, and how that affects us in the workplace. How it affects us in every institution.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come to a bit more on Black Lives Matter in a minute, but I mean, in your case, it was a gradual realization of the fact that there was discrimination, both personally and systematically, around being Black that led you to decide that you wanted to do something about it. So was it being in the union movement that made you feel empowered, or was there something specific that happened in your life that made you think, I've got to do more than just complain?
Being in the union, I think, yes, that did make me feel empowered. When you start, I mean, you know, I was once feeling like pretty helpless and worthless at some points in my life. And when I became a union rep, I began winning all these cases for members that some of them seemed impossible to win, but I just didn't back down. And then I began to look at, you know, the things that I had come up against, the discrimination that I had faced. And yes, I guess it was quite gradual. And certainly since last year, the whole uprising, that certainly lit a flame where I knew I had to do something more to defend and raise the issues of my community.
So was the murder of George Floyd a sort of focal point, a galvanizing point for you that made you realize you had a direction you had to go in?
Yes, but it was more than George Floyd. I mean, George Floyd happened, but let's not forget there are people that have died after contact with the police in this country. Rashan Charles died in Dalston. He died in a very, very similar way to how George Floyd died. And seeing the global response, it was triggering, it was alarming, but it was empowering. And so all of those things are the reasons why I definitely knew we had to do something locally. And from doing something locally, that has led to other things as well.
It's interesting what you said there, actually. I mean, you know, George Floyd was a particular horrific murder, but as you said, many people have been suffering for ages. Do you think a focal point like that, or Stephen Lawrence, for example, helps people to understand, or do you get angry that they sort of hide the scores of people who suffer?
Yeah, I think, yes, it's upsetting that we don't recognize, because when Rashan Charles was murdered, he died on camera. It was filmed. The footage circulated on social media for days, and it was horrific. It was the most horrific thing I'd ever seen, because it was on camera. But there was no global uprising, and there was no outcry, and there was no cry for reform. So it is very angering. And yes, I do think about George. I've never seen the footage of George Floyd's murder, by the way. I refuse to watch it. I've never watched it. I'm never going to watch it. It's just too much. It's too triggering, and you can't get images like that out of your head. So I chose not to watch it. But Rashan Charles was enough. And yeah, it's upsetting that it took that. I mean, it was all about timing as well, you see, with George Floyd in the US, because we just had this, we're coming through a pandemic. There's been a global lockdown, and everybody's becoming frustrating. It was maddening at the time. People didn't know what to do. As we're sort of working towards coming out of this lockdown, this murder happens on camera, and it sparks anger that was already ignited from the lockdown. And now the whole world has got a cause, and it's Black Lives Matter because of what happened to George Floyd right at that time.
So what did you decide to do when that happened? What was your path then in order to achieve what you wanted to achieve?
It was first of all, it was take to the streets. It was take to the streets and join everybody, because the amount of allies, you know, white people that have joined forces with us, all calling for change, was just one of the most incredible things that I'd ever seen. So it felt like you had to be a part of it. If you're Black and you're an activist, even if you weren't an activist before, that motivated a lot of people to go out there. So it was get out there on the streets. But then for me, it became, okay, we need to do something locally, because we have to focus on tangible things. There's got to be local campaigns that we've got to get involved in terms of Black Lives Matter. So the next thing, of course, was taking the opportunity to, you know, group together some people who were ready to come and join forces and set up Black Lives Matter Enfield. And then from there, it was like reaching out to Black-led, not just Black-led, organisations that support Black lives in some way, and reaching out to them. Enfield Caribbean Association being, I think, our main partner under the Black Lives Matter Enfield umbrella. But that's been one of the most fantastic partnerships that we've made. So in terms of campaigns, we can reach out to different groups and campaign together that way, which I think has been really effective.
I mean, the George Floyd case was a case of individual police brutality, but in a way it reflected a much wider issue around systematic and institutional racism, didn't it? And that's a real problem that even today we hear Cressida Dix, you know, deny that institutional racism exists in the police. Do you find that's a problem that you have to face, and that's one of your campaigns? You're not just about personal racism, it's about how the whole of society can embed it in itself.
Personal racism really hardly comes into it. It is about systemic and institutional racism. Cressida Dick makes a statement like that, but the figures are out there. I mean, the figures say that Black people, particularly in London, are now 9 to 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched by our white counterparts than our white counterparts. And what do you think that is, given the percentage of us in London? What could that possibly be? And the worst thing about that is the success rate of these stops and searches, because I think over 85% of them end in nothing. So it has a success rate of 15%. What organisation would continue with an initiative that's only 15% successful? So the idea that the police aren't institutionally racist is just laughable.
But the fact that there is institutional racism in a way, which is, you can see the way Black children are treated at school, the way the police somehow systematically discriminate sometimes against Black people. It's an institutional problem that needs to be confronted by legislation. So sometimes, do you get annoyed that you see MPs outside the House of Commons bending their knee, but going back into the House of Commons and not doing the things they should do?
Yeah, I find the empty gestures, this empty symbolism, it doesn't wash with Black communities. You know, standing in your office or outside of your building and taking the knee, and then supporting the police and denying that there's racism, it's like a slap in the face. Actually, I prefer you don't do it. I prefer you don't take the knee. Black people don't need this kind of performative solidarity. It's just it doesn't mean anything. What we need is people to address the issues of institutional racism within their workplaces. If you see that you've got a workplace that does not have any Black people in senior positions, although it has very capable Black people, it's an issue. If you see Black people being treated differently in the workplace to their white colleagues, it's an issue. If you see in your schools that Black children are being excluded at an alarming rate, the people who raise the issues of racism in workplaces, in education, with the police are Black people. We need allies to raise those issues within their workplaces and within those institutions. That is going to make a hell of a difference. I think in Black Lives Matter, we are quite open that it has to be Black-led. It has to be led by Black people because it's our issue, but we can't do it without our allies. And we appreciate our allyship support, but we need our allies to be raising those issues alongside us.
Okay, and some of the issues you raised, you mentioned exclusion from schools. You've been campaigning on that as well, haven't you? I actually think you put in a freedom of information request on that to Enfield Council. I don't know whether they answered or not, but that's something that concerns you, isn't it?
Well, I can tell you what happened. I already had official information. I won't say. Well, actually, I got it from a parent that I was escorting at one time, who had official information from Enfield Council. And then they denied those figures. When I did a freedom of information request, they came out with some completely different figures that were false as far as income tax, because we already had the official figures. And so that's the response we got from the council. But the thing is with them is that they denied there were any issues of racism within schools, institutional racism within schools in Enfield. But then they later set up an organisation called Nexus, which was looking into school exclusion, disproportionality of Black children. So, you know, on one hand, they were denying there was an issue. The next thing, they set up an organisation to look at the issue, which is, you know, I'm happy about that. But what we need to do as Black Lives Matter Enfield is now go and look at this Nexus organisation, which has received a lot of funding, which is great, as long as they're doing the work. That's what we need to see. We need to see the work that they are doing to tackle the disproportionality in the exclusions of Black children.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be interesting to follow up, and I think we'd be very interested in following that up with you. I mean, one of the other campaigns as well you're involved in is the incinerator, isn't it? And some people would say, well, the incinerator is not a racist issue, but some people say it is. It's environmental racism. Where do you stand on that?
Exactly, with the latter, it is environmental racism. If you look at where these incinerators are allowed to be built, I mean, this could take up the whole show, Francis. If you look at the places where these incinerators are allowed to be built, it's disproportionately where there are large populations of Black, brown, and other racial and ethnic groups. That's not an accident, that's by design. When they went to build an incinerator in Cambridgeshire, it was quickly battered away because the white middle class and upper middle class residents didn't want it, and the MP shouted out against it, and that went away. They don't have an incinerator. And it's interesting, I've listened to one of our Enfield MPs speak about the incinerator, and she said something on the lines of, if they were building it now, I'd have something to say about the disproportionality. But that's what they're doing. They're expanding it now. They're expanding it in an area that's already full of pollution because of the North Circular. It's already crammed and polluted. You know, when we look at the death of Ella Kissy Deborah, and where the coroner now ruled, which is unbelievable that the coroner has now ruled that, you know, pollution played a part in her death, and still the council will not take a step back and speak to local residents. I think it's absolutely appalling. There's enough information out there about how toxic these incinerators are, and we don't have to look, you don't even need the statistics to see the makeup of Edmonton in terms of the racial population. You can go to any part of Edmonton and just see it. So it is an issue. It's an issue because these incinerators are allowed to be built in areas that are already crammed, that are already poor. Because if this, you're not going to have an incinerator in Winchmore Hill. That's not going to happen. It would never happen. But they will dump it in Edmonton. And I think that's down to racism.
And the amazing thing is they're doing it when their own shadow minister says the age of incinerators is over. So that's quite a conflict in itself. You talked about you can't do it alone. You've got to make alliances. You've got to work with people. So, you know, the question is, how do we do that? How do we talk about racism? I've been all my life active in anti-racist movements, started the Enfield Committee for Racial Harmony back in the 1970s, campaigned against the National Front and so on. But in those days, I could not say the word black because I felt I was being a racist if I said that word, until I made programs in Liverpool with the Liverpool-born blacks there and found it was easy to say it. They wanted you to. They wanted to talk about race and to talk about colour and to create a dialogue as well. How important is it for you to talk about race, to get people to feel easy about doing it?
Well, and I know you mean well, but your language is very interesting there about getting people to feel easy, because when I'm talking about my race and the racial injustices that we face every day, I'm not going to enter into a conversation to make you or anybody feel comfortable. It is what it is. It's not comfortable. And we have to be able to, if we want to get somewhere and people want to call themselves allies, then we have to have those uncomfortable conversations. And then people will have to address their privilege and use their privilege to, you know, protect others. In our movement and in a lot of the work we do as activists, we have a lot of allies that are white, and they go out of their way to use the privilege that they have of having white skin to shield those who don't have that privilege. And one thing we can't do is, you mentioned white fragility earlier, and I'm glad that you mentioned it actually. And that comes down to the same thing. I'm not going to talk about race and racism and make you feel comfortable. We have to talk about the real issue. In terms of finding a way forward and building that allyship, it's about listening and learning. And in that listening and learning, you're going to have to listen to the difficult conversation. And you may have to address things about yourself. One of the things about racism, and I'll say this about the left as well, because there's a big hoo-ha going on social media at the moment. And these are left-wing people that call themselves anti-racist. And I can tell you that some of them are anything but. You know, they believe by saying, I'm a socialist, therefore I am anti-racist. Well, that's not how it goes. Because if you claim to be an anti-racist, you have to qualify that. And so the first step to qualifying your anti-racist credentials is dropping the white fragility, looking at your own privilege and listening to the voices of Black people. And when Black people are calling out racism, or Black people are showing you where there's disproportionality and how they're being treated differently, then it's for you to listen. And if you are our ally, amplify our voice and tackle that racism that we're dealing with.
I mean, it's quite interesting you sort of called me out on my language, because, and you're right to do it, because that's what the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo is about. I mean, she says, you know, the belief that racial discrimination can only happen when it's intentional is wrong. You hold some prejudices from the way you've been brought up and the language you use without knowing it or how it affects other people. So I suppose my question is, how do you get people to understand that? I guess we all have a form of fragility, whatever our race is, but in terms of discrimination against Black people, white fragility is a particular problem because you've been ruling the roost for years and years. How do we get people to confront their prejudices, all of us, and try then to, you know, not adapt it, but deal with it in a way that makes us positive towards each other?
Unfortunately, not everybody wants to confront prejudices. I mean, if we lived in, you know, the perfect world, everybody would want to listen and learn. Everybody would want to confront, you know, prejudice and discrimination, and then we could all move on together in perfect harmony. But that's not the real world. People have to want to look at prejudices. People have to want to confront them, and people have to accept that they are there, that they exist, that institutional racism exists, because we have these conversations all the time and we're always asked to qualify this position, but the statistics are out there. I mean, you know, the police, education, housing, you know, in every kind of institution, the statistics are there to show the disproportionality. So the onus has to be taken by the individual. To want to address the issue.
I mean, it's interesting you talked about left-wing racism, and someone asked a question about that by email to me, and that's where, you know, some people say, like I did, I spent all my life fighting racism, but that is no, you know, blank check to showing you're okay. And in terms of the left wing, they think, as you say, if they're radical, they're socialist, whatever, their credentials have got to be perfect, but somehow they're not, are they?
No, if you look at the most, I'm seeing some messages in the chat. It's typical, it's what you'd expect as a Black activist. Nothing that's been said in the chat would surprise me. That's what you're used to. We know where racism comes from. We expect the right wing to be racist. That's just standard, that's what it is. The most insidious type of racism, though, is from those on the left who say, I'm an anti-racist, and you ask them to qualify it and they can't, or you ask them to qualify it and they say, well, I supported Jeremy Corbyn. Well, so what? You can't compare yourself to his credentials, in my opinion, because he can qualify his anti-racist credentials. That man was arrested for campaigning against apartheid South Africa, and he's been on the right side of the anti-Black racist argument before I was even born. So you can't just qualify your anti-racism by just saying, well, I support Jeremy Corbyn, I'm a socialist, therefore I am anti-racist. No, it doesn't work like that. what have you done? What have you done to tackle institutional and systemic racism? And those difficult times when it's hard to call it out, when Black people are always on our own calling it out, where were you and what did you do? And that's how I measure credentials, not by tweets and just giving yourself this label.
Yeah. So, you know, we can talk to each other, we can try and confront our own attitudes and prejudices, which is great. Does it encourage you that sometimes in society where people live together, different nationalities, different ethnic groups, racism is less than it is in areas which are all homogenous, like a whole white area? Does it make you think that mixing helps, or does it create extra problems?
I don't accept that argument at all. I don't accept that where there's more Black, brown and other racial groups living together, there's less racism. I don't accept that at all. And because it's the whole idea of BAME, this terminology that was created, that's lazy, is actually quite racist. It's fake. It means that it tries to suggest that we're all one homogenous group, all these BAME people living together in perfect harmony. No, it doesn't work like that. There is, we suffer prejudice and racism from other ethnic groups. Plus, wherever you live as a Black person, you are experiencing racism. And if you go and move into a place where there's mainly white people, you're going to experience racism. But I don't think, I don't really accept that premise. I think it's kind of like it's like a false narrative, if you like.
Okay, so I mean, given the fact that you think that, you know, wherever you live, you're going to face racism, and I mean, clearly you are. If it is a multiracial group, there's still racism happening there. How can we move forward? I mean, how do we solve the problem? What do we do?
Well, I think in terms of those people that want to help to solve the problem, and again, I mean, I appreciate our allies that are always there with us. I appreciate our allies that use their privilege, fought to help us. I appreciate it, and we can't do without it. And I think that more conversations by those who are willing to change things, more conversations by people who are willing to accept that there is actually a problem. Not everybody's going to want to have that conversation. And truthfully, I don't waste time. I don't waste too much time debating with racist people and racist attitudes, because for me, it's a waste of time. I'd more rather spend time speaking to people who I can see want to make a difference, want to fight for change, want to be involved in the campaigns, and want to listen and learn. And so if people want to do that, there's always a space for us to do that together. And I'd love to do more of that as well.
And, you know, given your own experience, do you think there's enough of those people around to have those alliances who will understand and who will work with you in the way that you're talking?
There's always room for more. There's loads of people like that. We've got lots and lots of allies. We've got amazing people that I can work with, that, you know, I can be in situations where I don't have to raise the issues of disproportionality. They will raise them. You know, they really do use those voices. But there's always room for more. I think maybe in Enfield, we need to have spaces where we can have more of these discussions in safe spaces where people won't feel jumped on or set upon. But, you know, on the other end of that, it's that people don't take offense when Black people are raising the issues of racism. And I think, yes, there is space for that, and I think we should do more of it. This is why I'm glad you invited me on this space tonight.
Okay, I mean, well, we could talk more about that, and you know, you saying you'd like to get more conversations going is something I hope that, you know, a lot of us can develop, because I think that's really important to do it in the right way. So if people wanted to find out more about what you're doing about Black Lives Matters and all the many campaigns you're on, how would they do with it? How would they do that, and how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, you can message us on our Facebook group, or you can DM us. and we'll respond to you, because we are involved in such a lot. And also, some of the things that we're doing nationally, it's directly linked to what's happening locally. Like, so you will see that I'm involved in United for Black Lives, and some of our members are on the chat tonight, getting into it with somebody on there. United for Black Lives is a coalition of BLM groups from across the UK, BLM groups and Black-led organisations from across the UK. It's one of the most powerful things to come out of the last year for the UK. And we have been working on the Kill the Bill, well, Kill the Bill official campaign, and you'll see some of the big demos that we've been organising in central London. And that is because of the government, as a direct result of the Black Lives Matter protests that happened last year after George Floyd was murdered. The government's response to that is to try to curtail our rights to protest. And in Enfield, you know, we had a lot of protests in Edmonton. We did it the last Saturday of the month for several months. So it's important that we focus on the PSC, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, because we can't allow the government to take away our right to protest. That's the way we challenge systemic and institutional racism, and so it's ever so important. And all of those things you can see on the BLM Enfield Facebook page, and you can DM us if you want to get in contact with us. I can't believe half an hour has gone already.
Well, it has. It goes very quickly in these interviews, and you know, that was really interesting. And I think some of the things you said are so important, and the positive things about, you know, engaging in conversations and keeping that going, as well as the protesting side. Both sides are important to come together, and I think you do that well, and you've done a lot of work, and that's really great. That was going to be the end of the interview. But because in the webinars we open it up to anyone who wants to come on. In this particular webinar, we had one or two people who had really racist views. And one of them came up with the classic slogan, "Why don't you go home?" which is a terrible racist thing to say. And Delia answered it perfectly. And we're going to end this webinar interview with Delia's answer. So let's hear it now.
I have seen someone in the chat saying, "Go home." Go home, Delia. Well, I just want to say to that person, I am home. This is my home. I was born and bred here. I am a Black British woman, and I will continue to raise the issues that Black people face in society. And that's it. We're home.